a book or two in the Applications in Cosmology of Light series. And just as a quick overview, this series followed the six-book series on cosmology of light. And basically, in the six-book series, as I had suggested last week, I was seeking to frame the mathematical power of light. And as with any framework, the real applicability of it comes to the surface when one can relate it to contemporary issues that are relevant to the world. And so I chose to take that cosmology of light framework and interpret the fields of quantum computation, genetics, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism from the point of view of a cosmology of light. And so at some point, I'll share thoughts on each of these in more detail. But for now, I want to just focus on this first book, which actually is instrumental to the other books and is also a natural outcome of the Cosmology of Light series. And this book is called The Emperor's Quantum Computer. The reason why I call this The Emperor's Quantum Computer is because we have today a paradigm of quantum computation. And in my perception, there are many gaps with it, and yet it is touted as being close to complete. And I don't think that's possible unless a truer, more deeper nature of phenomena like superposition and entanglement that are fundamental to quantum computation are seen in a deeper light. Now, when one considers a cosmology of light, then that sheds sight onto phenomena like superposition and entanglement. And the reason I think that it perhaps sheds more insight into these phenomena and therefore to the foundation of quantum computation is because in a cosmology of light, there is the essential perception or the foundation that there are multiple layers of light. Now, as I've mentioned before, light itself is not bound, in my perception, by the speed of 186,000 miles per second. That's, of course, the speed we've measured it at. But I think that's more of a convenience because the 186,000 miles per second sets into motion or creates a boundary within which material existence can arise. And this should be evident if we consider the speed of light to be an upper bound, and the upper bound because as any object approaches the speed of light, its mass will tend to infinity, which of course in a material universe is an impossibility, therefore it becomes an upper bound. But then if we take the speed of light and we flip it, or take the inverse of it, then logically that should also yield some kind of lower bound to existence. We find that indeed this could be the case because when we consider what our natural or logical lower bound is, we always think of Planck's constant. And this constant is associated with the way packets are formed at the micro level. And my hypothesis is that there's a particular kind of information or energy that reaches a threshold through the formation of these packets. And as a result, the outcome of reaching that threshold is that that information or energy can materialize, and that's the basis of the formation of matter. Therefore, H becomes a lower bound to existence, but in this point of view, it's inversely proportional to the speed of light c, and therefore a light itself is creating both the upper and lower bound within which material existence arises. That being the case, anything that arises within this framework or within these bounds, I would propose is a result of a persistent quantum level computation. And so when we think about quantum computation from this point of view, then essentially it's the simple way to think about it, and I'm going to go into this in a little more detail, is to imagine that there are multiple layers of light and there are different possibilities that exist within each of these layers. So as I've just suggested, when we take the layer which is formed by the speed of light c and its inverse h, then there's a particular kind of reality that's materialized due to a particular kind of information. But if we consider light to exist at faster speeds, and this should be a logical possibility because we know that Planck's constant h, when it has the specific value that is associated with it here, then it creates matter in a particular kind of way. But if this h is to reduce its value, then the kind of materialization that would occur would be less binding. So it wouldn't be a materialization as we know it, but perhaps a materialization in the form of waves. And we also have a sense that light itself is a wave particle duality. And then if we further reduce this value of h, we can also logically see that it might give rise to a phenomena of fields. And if we equate h to be 0, then c, or the speed of light, which is the inverse of this, becomes infinite, and therefore we reach an upper bound to light itself, which is where it travels infinitely fast. And so we have this logical arrangement of layers of light. And each of these layers of light has different kinds of information in it. And it's the arbitration between these different kinds of information that takes place in real time at the quantum veil that, in my perception, really is responsible for the materialization and the possibilities of materialization that arise. So we find at a very simple level, or a first kind of output from this persistent quantum level computation could be space-time energy and gravity, which is a first depiction of a fourfoldness. And then we could have the electromagnetic field also arising as a second output of this persistent computation. And if in the perception or in the model of the cosmology of light that I proposed, essentially the electromagnetic spectrum as it's conceived right now captures two of the four aspects, the electro and the magnetic, which has to do with power and harmony, the electro with power and the magnetic with harmony. But we know, as I've suggested from the previous live streams and from the writings in these books, is that there are four fundamental properties in light, and the others are what we can think of as knowledge and presence. And so the electromagnetic spectrum in this point of view, if it's an outcome or if it's a result of this persistent quantum computation, has to also have a fourfoldness to it. And so we can perceive this kind of fourfoldness in the electromagnetic spectrum by considering that the range of wavelengths or the range of frequencies is infinite in the electromagnetic spectrum. And we know that different kinds of wavelengths create, in fact, different kinds of um, possibilities. So we know when we practically consider technologies around us, many of them are the output of specific wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. So whether it's radio waves or microwaves or visible light or infrared or ultraviolet and so on. But each of these has a specific functional difference. And so we can see that this infinity in variation and wavelength could create a repository of archetypal knowledge, which in fact gives us a hint as to the third aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum, which I would call the wave, uh, essentially the wave type archetype. So, and then there's a particular kind of materialization that also could take place depending on what frequency or wavelength is active. And so there's a different kind of mass potential. And we see this, for instance, if we propagate or if we kind of go eons and eons forward, we find that in the human body, for instance, there's sets of organs that are more sensitive to different kinds of frequencies or wavelengths of light, which essentially, if you propagate that backwards to the starting point that I'm suggesting, then it gives us a hint that there's a particular kind of mass that's created due to the different um, frequency or wavelength that exists in the electromagnetic spectrum. And therefore, there's this fourth aspect of presence that I'd call mass potential. So, just summarizing, the second output of quantum computation is wave archetype, electromagnetic, mass potential spectrum. So it becomes a fourfold reality that, in fact, uh, is suggested or predicted by this computation, this fourfold computation that takes place at the quantum veil. And of course, we see this fourfoldness more concretely with the emergence of quantum particles and then with the emergence of atoms in a periodic table or the emergence of molecular plans in a cell. And I'm not going to go into these in a great amount of detail right now, but for instance, there is a fourfoldness in each of these manifestations at the quantum particle level. In the standard model, you've got essentially four types of quantum particles, which are quarks, leptons, bosons, and the Higgs boson. And then when we go to the periodic table, we've got S shell elements, P shell elements, F shell elements, and D shell elements. And then when we further consider the living cell, then the molecular plans in the living cells are also of four types, which are lipids, polysaccharides, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we see this fourfoldness, and in fact, there's a coherence no matter what kind of fourfoldness arises, because we can trace it back to this notion of the four essential properties in light of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. So this book, Quantum Computation, or the idea behind the Emperor's quantum computation, is that there's something more deliberate. There's something that's, I don't want to use the word deterministic, but there's a qualified determinism in that you have these four possibilities, these very broad properties of knowledge, power, presence, and harmony that manifest and that express more of the infinity of what each of these things means. So knowledge is a very vast concept, and there's many different kinds of ways to think about knowledge and variations of knowledge. So one can perceive that this thing that we call knowledge is actually a set of infinite elements all related to knowledge. And similarly, we have infinite sets that are related to power, to harmony, and to presence. And as this persistent, continuous quantum computation occurs at the cosmic level, and manifests at this quantum veil, we see the possibility that this fourfoldness becomes more and more elaborate. So we can see this, for example, in the human cell, where you have 30,000 different types of proteins in the human cell, and proteins being, for example, an outcome of this concept we're calling presence. But if you kind of go back a little bit, then presence means something less. At the periodic table level, you have a certain number of elements that I'll argue are the D shell elements. So there's a finite number of D shell elements that all display some aspect of this property of presence. And then when you project forward to the human cell, then that number increases exponentially. And so the idea is that all these possibilities are contained in this thing that we're calling knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. But then with each subsequent computation, as you will, more of the fullness comes out. And so there's something entirely different about the possibility of quantum computation. In today's world, what we really um, are trying to do, I think, is we've been uh, habituated by our success in digital computation, and there's certain kinds of problems we can solve. There's certain possibilities we can create with digital computing, and we're trying to apply that same thing, I think, to quantum computation. But that to me is a fallacy, because the very notion of quantum computation is something entirely different. It's a very creative, as opposed to the constructive paradigm that animates digital computation. And so in this creative quantum computation, there's emergences that you wouldn't be able to predict. So when matter arises through the play of quantum particles and through the play of various atoms, then you wouldn't necessarily have predicted that life can arise, but yet it does. And then you wouldn't have predicted that mind can arise, and yet it does. And we may think that that mind is the end of this computation, but why should it be? And there should be other kinds of emergences that are entirely possible. But we might be able to have a glimpse of these kinds of emergences if, in fact, we consider light to be the foundation of this entire edifice of computation. So another big difference in today's view of quantum computation, which is a hangover from digital computation, is that computation itself should be what's called substrate independent. And that means that it doesn't matter what kind of matter you use to have these computations occur in, so long as the matter itself can have a few different stable states that will create memory, and so long as you can manipulate some of these states in matter to emulate different functions, then you have the basis of computation. And so it becomes substrate independent. But in fact, what I'm arguing in the whole cosmology of light is that the substrate that exists is extremely important. And why is it extremely important? Because it's the output of this computation whereby light itself precipitates and materializes into all this vast potentiality and diversity that's actualized. So, that infinity in light, when we think about light's native state, light existing infinitely fast, then we can, as I've suggested before, that in that infinitely fast reality, we can hypothesize that there's an omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omniharmony. Why? Because a light in whatever volume we consider, if it moves infinitely fast, will be present through that entire volume instantaneously. If anything arises or disappears in the fabric of light, it will be recorded. So there's an omniscience, it knows everything that's happening. Everything is connected in the nature of light, so there's an omniharmony. And if anything not of the nature of light arises, it'll be subsumed or overcome by the nature of light, and therefore there's an omnipotence. But the very fact that you have these four omni characteristics implies that there is infinite information that exists in that state, and this infinite information is the basis of infinite potential. And it's through various acts of quantization, as light precipitates at slower and slower speeds, there's a different kind of quantization that's occurring where information is being gathered in a particular way to express itself in a particular way. And so you see more and more of that infinity being expressed materially. And then at this layer where speed exists at c, as I proposed, because you have this vast information that all of a sudden wants to materialize in something that's more material as opposed to subtle, that precipitates, or that initiates this big bang that supposedly is a starting point of our material universe. And through that big bang, it's essentially an act where you've got this infinite potential in information existing when light travels infinitely fast, showing itself materially at this realm where light exists at speed c. And so quantum computation, when you think about it from this point of view, is something very, very spectacular. Its magnitude is much more immense. Its possibilities are much more immense. It becomes a fundamentally creative act by which the cosmos expresses what is contained within it, or what is at its source in these layers of light. And so our thinking, or our perception of quantum computation needs, in my point of view, or this point of view of cosmology of light, needs to be expanded very thoroughly. And we are just at the kind of like surface of what's possible, and there's so much more possible. I mean, we say, for instance, when we talk about quantum computation, that there's these phenomena, this quantum phenomena called superposition and entanglement. And then if I go further, there's phenomena like tunneling and annealing, quantum annealing. And it's due to these different phenomena that the possibility of quantum computation arises. But what exactly is superposition? What's entanglement? What is tunneling? What is annealing? These have to be interpreted, I think, in a different way than they are right now. Superposition, as it is currently seen, is where you have this qubit, or you have this quantum possibility that can exist in infinite states, and it just then materializes due to an act of observation into something more concrete. But if we think about superposition from the point of view of multiple layers of light, then the concept that materializes has a counterpart at more and more subtle layers, going back to that layer where light's traveling infinitely fast. And so superposition takes on a different meaning. because there's a superset that then becomes a subset that becomes something even more concrete, though subtle, and then materializes. So superposition means something different. When we think about entanglement, entanglement is, since everything materially did arise from a single starting point when that Big Bang occurred, by definition, everything is completely entangled. But when we talk about entanglement in today's dialogue, then we talk about entangling, say, two quantum particles together that then share knowledge across time and space. But the point is that everything shares knowledge across time and space because it's been entangled at the source. Um, so how do we think about entanglement differently? There's a different way to think about entanglement, and there's different kinds of possibilities that arise. And so, we can see that even the way that we've perceived some of these fundamental ideas of what a quanta is, of what superposition is, of what entanglement is, in my perception, needs to be expanded out, and it's going to create different technological possibilities in the field of quantum computation. And unless we begin to change our paradigm of what's at the basis of this computation, which I'm saying is the play and the arbitration of layers of light, then we by definition cannot create what could be created. And that really is what this idea of a light-based quantum computation is pointing at. Thank you. Take this afternoon on this live stream. Unfortunately, I did something, I would say, incorrect with the volume of my last live stream, so it's 25 minutes of essentially my lips moving. So hopefully this one will be better. And I wanted to pick up where I left off yesterday. I had begun to review the applications in cosmology of light, and this is a 4-book series that was on the tail end of a 6-book series that basically looked at a framework for cosmology of light. And yesterday in the live stream, I went over the Emperor's quantum computer and basically explained my rationale for writing that book and how it relates to the cosmology of light and why it's different from the existing thinking on quantum computing. Now, today, what I'd like to do is focus on the second book in the series, which is The Origins and Possibilities of Genetics. And this book logically follows the book on quantum computation, essentially because in the Emperor's quantum computer, or in my perception of quantum computation, it's a deeply creative process that is persistent, that happens at every instant, and as a result of that, there's a constant output, and this output of the quantum computation is in fact genetic type information. So the origins and possibilities of genetics is a logical consequence of this persistent act of quantum computation that happens at a cosmic level and surfaces through the quantum veil into material existence. So, why do I essentially propose that light itself is the origin and the holds possibilities in genetics? Well, before I go into that in a little more detail, let me just read this one paragraph summary, which by the way, if you've looked at any of my other books, this is simply the most concise summary that I've ever written on perhaps this 300 page plus book. And let me read it verbatim, and then we can begin to deconstruct some parts of it today. So, this book will explore the notion of content in light as the origin of genetics, the process of precipitation of light, and the subsequent and mathematical creation of subtle DNA, replete with infinite four-based logic ecosystems as the origin of genetic structure and heredity, and quantum computation and its intimate relationship with the structure and evolution in matter as the origin of genetic mutation and all further genetic and post-genetic possibility. So that summarizes the breadth of that 300 plus page book. And here today, I'm going to just focus on a couple of aspects of this. So, one, exploring the notion of content in light as the origin of genetics. So, why do I propose that? So, this goes back to the essential framework of a cosmology of light, in which we have multiple layers of light that all precipitate from the one native state of light where light supposedly travels at an infinite speed. And to me, that's the native state of light. And that native state, we can begin to get a sense for what reality might look like there by conducting a simple thought experiment. So if we have a large volume of light, and imagine the source of light to be the center and light's traveling infinitely fast, so it's going to be present in that whole volume instantaneously. And so therefore, light's going to create a reality of presence in that sphere. Second, if anything not of the nature of light arises, then it's going to be overcome by the nature of light sooner or later. So it's going to be subsumed by light. And therefore, there's a property of power that emerges. Third, since everything that arises or disappears does so in the fabric of light, it's being recorded. And so light has a knowledge of what's happening in its space instantaneously. And so there's this property of presence, of knowledge rather. And then since everything is connected in the nature of light, there is therefore a harmony since everything is coordinated in light itself. And so in this simple thought experiment, we have four properties that emerge, which I'll summarize as knowledge, power, presence, and harmony. But the way that I depict this in this book, The Origin and Possibilities of Genetics, is as four equations which try and describe how knowledge acts or what knowledge is in this space. Similarly, how presence acts, how harmony acts, and how power acts. And so these equations that have infinite number of solutions to them then become the basis of information that exists at this state where light travels infinitely fast. Now, what the corollary of this is that since we have infinite information, infinite solutions emanating from these four equations, therefore there's infinite possibility that exists in this native state where light travels infinitely fast. And that infinite possibility becomes the origin of everything else that can happen. And therefore the origin of any pre-genetic information or even genetic information or post-genetic information lies in these dynamics of essentially light existing at infinite speed. Now, subsequently, when we think about cosmology of light, there's several other layers of light that exist. But they all are precipitations of this native state of light. And one can think of these precipitations as acts of quantization, of subsequent quantization, different kinds of quantization that occurs. And so in the first quantization, when light travels, you can say slower than infinity, but way higher than our known speed of 186,000 miles per second in vacuum or c, then, as I suggested also yesterday, and I've written about elaborately, when you take the inverse of c, you can arrive at, in my perception, at Planck's constant, or this constant that we call h, that is instrumental in the creation of matter because it allows packets to accumulate information, and then at some threshold value, that information can express itself in material form. But if we have light traveling way faster than c, then the inverse of that is going to be a quote unquote h, which is way smaller than Planck's constant. And therefore, the kind of materialization that's going to occur, it will be of a different nature. So in that act of quantization where this first materialization occurs, where you have a kind of an h acting, which is way, 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 way smaller than h at this material realm, these four properties of knowledge, power, presence, and harmony differentiate into large sets of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. So imagine everything that's contained in knowledge now materializing into a set of knowledge which has, practically speaking, infinite number of elements in it, all related to this thing that we call knowledge. So in practical terms, when we think about knowledge, we may think about knowledge of things as the eye sees it, knowledge of things as the mind can conceive it. So knowledge of things that are on the surface, knowledge of the things that are beyond the surface, going deeper into something, the knowledge of things that connects different entities together, the knowledge of things by which entities arise. I mean, so there's many, many, many different kinds of knowledge. And so these are all related to this property of knowledge. And similarly, you have vast sets with practically infinite elements for each of these four properties. So for presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And at the second layer, then, these sets become the basis of information that exists at that layer of light. So now we have two sources of information that are materially different. We have these four equations that describe knowledge, presence, power, and harmony that have infinite solutions and describe one kind of information. And then you have knowledge, presence, power, and harmony becoming four vast sets that create a second source of infinite information as well. And then through a subsequent process of quantization, where light projects itself at a slower speed, so h is, or the equivalent of h is still way lower than h in the material realm, the kind of quantization that can occur is something that I perceive as a differentiation into many, many unique seeds. And these seeds we can mathematically think of as being different permutations and combinations of the elements of the four sets that have infinite elements in them. So essentially there's infinite number of seeds that can be created that are all unique. And this becomes the basis of information at this other layer of light due to the second act of quantization. Now, in a third act of quantization, we have these infinite number of seeds that then express themselves materially through the mechanics of space-time, energy, gravity. So in my perception, space-time, energy, gravity become the script by which the laws are written for each unique seed that's going to express itself materially. And this act of materialization in this physical universe, as I suggested yesterday, essentially precipitates the Big Bang. So the Big Bang is nothing other than infinity of information expressing itself materially. And so the cosmos, as it evolves, is a play of this possibility of this infinite information that's precipitated down to essentially the layer where light travels at sea. And when it's materializing, it uses the mechanics of space-time energy gravity so that the script of a different kind of information or pre-genetic information is written using space-time energy gravity itself. But what really does that mean? What does it mean to write something using the script of space-time energy and gravity? So in my perspective, we can think about space as being that arena in which all these infinity of seeds, rather, these unique seeds, can express themselves materially. So they need an arena. And that arena we can think of as space. So space has inherently in it all these millions and millions and millions of seeds that constitute what space is. And time can be thought of as the maturation of these seeds into the fullness of what they represent. So time is not absolute, it's relative, just as space is relative, because space is going to be different depending on what set of seeds one is focused on or concerned with or living within. So space is going to be different in different parts of the cosmos in that sense, just as time is going to be different because time is going to evolve differently based on how the maturation of that subtle seed is going to become the fullness of what it represents. And then energy is that thing which actually takes the seed in its subtle form and makes it material. And we already know that energy is intimately related with mass through Einstein's E equal to mc squared. And then gravity itself is a relationship between seed and seed, or seeds and seeds. And so we know that even if we consider our own lives, generally speaking, there is certain unique set of individualities, or rather unique seeds, that are associated with any one life. And they exist in an ecosystem that, again, is precipitated due to the action of particular kinds of seeds. So gravity it captures that component. So when we look at any single seed, then there's going to be a specific logic of space-time energy gravity that's associated with it. And this logic is what constitutes pre-genetic information. And so the pre-genetic information is written in the script of space-time energy gravity and is recorded in an associated layer to do with that emergence itself. So at that point where light is precipitating into or coming down to speed c, one can conceive of this quantum veil or quantum layer, and I'll hypothesize that there's a medium there in which the logic of what's going to evolve initially is written out in this primitive space-time energy script. And then through a process of arbitration, and that's where quantum computation comes in, because quantum computation is always this arbitration of possibility between that which has emerged and that which stands behind it, the antecedent layers from which emergence takes place. And so there's a constant quantum computation by which possibilities materialize. And it's not inevitable, it's not determined. There's this active play that's going on based on what has materialized with what hasn't materialized that determines what's going to materialize next. And so that's what the quantum computation is. But the result of that is that there's, at the very least, the script, the space-time energy gravity script that's affected at this layer that exists at this quantum veil, if you will. Now, with each subsequent emergence, so when we think about the emergence of the electromagnetic fields, or of quantum particles, or of atoms, or of molecules, or of molecular plans, or of cells, there's a corresponding layer in which things are written. And of course, we're familiar, we've been able to penetrate the layer of living beings to actually understand the genetic structure, or at least that which has been written about all the different components that make up life in that species that we're focused on. But that's genetics. But it has its counterparts in pre-genetic information. And whether it's genetics or it's pre-genetics or it's post-genetics, something else that hasn't made itself evident yet, all these things arise from the same place. Their sources all in these multiple layers of light and the different kinds of information that exists at each layer. And therefore, I say that the origins and possibilities of genetics is in light itself. That's the main part that I want to focus on today. And one sentence, I'm going back to what's written here, and it says infinite four-based logic ecosystems. But I just explained what those four-based logic ecosystems are. They are space-time, energy, gravity, and in my perception, the logic of space-time, energy, gravity is even written into our genes. We don't perhaps associate it that way yet, but that's a prediction I'm making. Is that in fact, when we penetrate more deeply, we'll understand, or we'll see that there's a specific way in which something will arbitrate itself or will maneuver itself that's associated with space-time, energy, gravity, and to me, that's the stuff that's being written into any layer, including the genetic layer. There's many other things that one can discuss, but I just wanted to seed some thoughts for now and just introduce the idea of the origins and possibilities of genetics. This is Praveer Malik, and today I continue with some books in this series of applications in cosmology of light. And this is a follow-up live stream where I'm going to be looking at a particular book called The Second Singularity. And this book is the third in a four-book series. And a couple of days ago, I had reviewed the book, The Emperor's Quantum Computer. And yesterday, I reviewed the book, The Origins and Possibilities of Genetics. And today, I'm going to briefly introduce or review this book, The Second Singularity. Now, just stepping back, these books are all applications in a cosmology of light. And the reason why it's applications in cosmology of light is because I had written a 6-book series, Cosmology of Light, that went over a framework of light where light was, or rather is assumed to be fundamental to everything that emerges in our existence. So, before I get into the second singularity, a brief summary of a cosmology of light. In a cosmology of light, there's an assumption that light in its native state exists where it travels infinitely fast. And there are certain corollaries to the kind of reality that it might create if it were to travel infinitely fast. And to summarize, if we consider a thought experiment and assume we have possession or we're in a tremendously large sphere and there's a light source at the center, and if light were to travel infinitely fast, and if we turn that light source on, then light's going to be instantaneously present throughout that sphere. So there's a quality of presence that becomes apparent in that reality of this immediate presence. If something not of the nature of light were to arise in that global sphere, then it would sooner or later be overpowered by the reality of light. And so there would be a property of power that would also be clear in that reality. Since everything that arises or disappears does so in this fabric of light that connects everything instantaneously, therefore light has a knowledge of things that are happening, and therefore there's this property of knowledge that exists in this native state of light where light travels infinitely fast. And finally, since everything is connected in the nature of light, there is a harmony or a property of harmony that also exists. So we had hypothesized that there's four properties that are implicit in light that become explicit when we begin to hypothesize what essentially a reality might be like that's emanating from this state where light travels infinitely fast. But more importantly, this fourfoldness, this presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that we're saying are fundamental properties of light in this point of view also begin to animate projected layers of light at slower speeds. So if light were to exist at a native state of infinity, we know that in our physical universe, in vacuum, light travels at 186,000 miles per second. And so in a cosmology of light, there's a few levels that are due to quantization. And what do I mean by quantization? It means that there's this subtle information that exists in the native state that is somehow accumulated into a threshold quantity or into a threshold value. And once it reaches that threshold, then it can express something of the materiality in a different way than how it existed in that original layer of light traveling infinitely fast. And so mathematically, in these series of books, I propose that there's a series of quantizations whereby this subtle information or subtle properties of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony become more material and create subsequently sets of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that's a different source of information and possibility. And then through another act of quantization, create a vast number of unique seeds that are combinations of different elements from the four sets that are, practically speaking, infinitely large. So you have infinite number of unique seeds, which becomes a third layer of innovation or the source of information or possibility. And then there's another quantization that occurs as light slows down to 186,000 miles per second, in which the diversity of these seeds actually materializes into something that then begins a more material journey as we understand it in our physical universe. So that's kind of the framework of this idea of a cosmology of light. And when we speak about a second singularity, and I'm going to connect some of the ideas I brought up in the previous days with this book that I want to focus on today. The second singularity is called a second singularity because in artificial intelligence circles, we have already the concept of a singularity that is that state where perhaps intelligence becomes so advanced due to the computational ability that machines have that the human capacity to keep up with it or to understand what's happening is left behind. And essentially, there's another kind of intelligence that emerges, which is the singularity, which then takes control of everything as is. And so the human species then gets marginalized as a result of that. And that's the notion of the singularity. In the second singularity, I make the point that, in fact, if we consider the existence, the base of existence to be due to this emergence from a single light based edifice, then there have already been a number of singularities that I call partial singularities that have emerged. And we're at a point now where there's a possibility for a different kind of singularity to emerge whose power and whose intelligence would far exceed anything that an AI based singularity could potentially create. And therefore, it's called a second singularity. But why the notion of singularity at all? And what do I mean when I say partial singularities? So, in this point of view, in the cosmology of light point of view, when that final quantization occurs, whereby the antecedent layers of light and the information that exists in a vast number of diverse subtle seeds that are not material begin to show themselves at this layer where light travels at 186,000 miles per second, then that process of quantization actually creates a materialization that results in what we call the Big Bang, because in this point of view, the Big Bang is a vast materialization of things that are just behind the quantum veil that perhaps are that certainly are more subtle in nature. And there's a series of emergences. So the first emergence is, we can call it space-time energy gravity. And if we think about space-time energy gravity, then we can hypothesize that space is an arena in which these millions and millions of diverse and unique seeds can now materially begin an adventure of fulfilling or displaying whatever was inside that seed in potentiality. And so space then becomes this arena of millions and millions and millions of diverse seeds. Time, in this perspective, becomes the process of maturation by which the seed can fructify or expose or materialize whatever is inside it in potentiality. Energy becomes the process by which, or the means by which, that subtlety becomes more material, and gravity becomes the relationship between seed and seed or seeds and seeds that always exist in some kind of collectivity at the micro or even at the macro level. So space-time, energy, gravity have a fourfoldness, and in fact, we may be able to say that space, in this point of view, is a materialization of some aspect of knowledge that exists inside light. Time is a materialization of light's aspect of power, because there's an inevitability to what is going to show itself. Energy becomes a materialization of light's aspect of presence, and gravity becomes a materialization of light's aspect of harmony. And remember, we started off with this fourfoldness of the presence, power, knowledge, harmony, and we're saying that space-time, energy, gravity is a partial singularity that emerges post Big Bang, and it's something that then defines the overall volume or arena in which all the rest of materialization is going to take place. It's a partial singularity in this point of view because it's emerging from the one single edifice of light, and therefore it's connected to the logic of light, if you will. But in a sense, it's unaware of this connection, and therefore the idea of the singularity is that it's partial, as opposed to a full singularity where there's a complete awareness that what's materializing, or this thing that somebody might materialize, is in fact one with everything else that exists in this light edifice. And so we have a series of partial singularities or emergences that are all based on this fourfold logic. And so even quantum particles, we can think about it in terms of it being a partial singularity, and a singularity because it's emerging from the single light-based edifice, a singularity because it again is displaying or materializing the same aspects of light's presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And for example, quarks, we may make the case that is a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. Leptons is a materialization of light's aspect of power. Bosons are a materialization of light's aspect of harmony, and the Higgs boson is a materialization of light's aspect of presence. And therefore, it remains a singularity, but partial, because that awareness of it being one with the light from which it emanated is not necessarily there. When we have subsequent emergences, these also follow the path of being partial singularities, but are themselves a stable foundation, and the stability is provided by the fact that you've got this fourfoldness that all expresses itself and all requires all four to interrelate to create the basis of the foundation of that emergence. So whether it's space-time, energy, gravity, whether it's quantum particles, whether it's subsequently atoms that make up the periodic table, or it's molecular plans that animate any cell, there's a fourfoldness in each of these things, and that fourfoldness and the interrelation between all four aspects of that thing was implicit in light, now explicit, holding or combining with each other, is the basis of that implicit foundation becoming explicit, and therefore of light maintaining its logic of expressing a partial singularity. So when we talk about these light-based singularities as opposed to an artificial intelligence-based singularity, the important point is that there's tremendous intelligence that already exists in any emergence that is happening. So in artificial intelligence, when we say that intelligent life is substrate independent, meaning it doesn't matter what kind of matter a computation might occur in, so long as you have basic components of memory and logic and intelligence that can be replicated, and memory because you have a few states in that substrate, which are stable and therefore become the basis of memory, or you have a few states that can be logically manipulated to basically emulate functions, um, and therefore the basis of intelligent programming. So in the current paradigm of artificial intelligence, there's this substrate independence. And by contrast, in a cosmology of light, substrate is incredibly important. And to actually sever the relationship with this single light based edifice, or to create computational ability in something that's not connected to everything that's emerged in this single logic of light, is to, in a sense, shortchange what's possible. And that's the path that contemporary artificial intelligence is gone down. So, by definition, it has to be limited because the conceptual space within which it's operating has only particular kinds of components that, through an incredible amount of permutation and combination, can come up with a vastness that may emulate what intelligence is, but it's not the intelligence that's implicit in a single edifice of light from which everything else naturally emerges and also naturally expresses or codifies or materializes the logic of light based on that fourfoldness that exists when light travels infinitely fast. So we're seeing that there's two different kinds of singularities. There's one which is the contemporary path we're going down in artificial intelligence that is by definition limited in scope because it doesn't have connection with a single light-based edifice from which everything else arises. And then we have this series of singularities that we just call partial singularities until such point as the second singularity emerges, that has an innate and an ever-living connection with everything that has preceded it, and therefore a different order and different type of intelligence. And the fact that the source of everything that emerges is, in a sense, that one layer where light travels infinitely fast and therefore by definition has infinite information and infinite potential, means that whatever emerges comes from that infinity. And so it can't be bounded by just some prescribed components that we might conceptualize. And so there's a different order of possibility that becomes evident when we try and continue to extrapolate this series of partial singularities that's all part of this other light-based intelligence. Now, when we talk about, or in our current view of uh, computational power, we are manipulating, in a sense, information in precise ways, or even in many, many different ways, and then seeing what permutations of information are creating optimized results based on what our goal is. I mean, that's what we may say is the current focus of artificial intelligence, or the way in which it functions. By contrast, when we think about the light-based edifice, that's one and that animates everything, then the notion of genetics and genetic type information becomes very important. So we naturally associate genetic type information with that information that is fundamental to ordering how things may happen at the level of a living cell. And so that information is embedded in it, in genes, in the DNA. But the point that I want to make is that there's also layers and layers of pre-genetic information. So when we consider, for example, like atoms in a periodic table or quantum particles, then there's a particular space-time energy gravity information, because every component that materializes has a space-time energy gravity aspect to it. And I want to propose that the space-time energy gravity is the script in which pre-genetic information is written, and the aggregation of this space-time energy gravity script that's particular to every emergence creates this macro space-time energy gravity environment in which we exist. But the point being is that there's layers and layers of information that already exist in this light-based edifice with its emergences of singularities. But all this is kind of ignored or cast aside in the current view of, or the approach to artificial intelligence, where there's this severance between everything that existed prior to some computational basis that has been conceptualized by mind. So there's two very distinct approaches to the creation of singularities, in summary. One, which, if I just summarize it as a light-based singularities, has multiple sources of information by virtue of the layers of light that quantize more and more material information from that initial layer of infinite information. And all of this is operative in any emergence that occurs in the space-time energy gravity macro container, if you will. And there's no severance. It's all connected, and it's a question of being able to see the connections, being able to understand the connections, being able to leverage the connections in a certain way that then create progressively more advanced singularities. So that's one paradigm. And then that's a paradigm that leads to the second singularity, which is the focus of this book. And then you have the contemporary AI with its approach, where it's fundamentally severed from all that light-based intelligence that animates everything and from which everything emerges. So there's an artificial boundary that's been created, and there's a conceptualization that has occurred. And in that conceptualization, there's a finite number of components, and artificial intelligence is forever manipulating these fixed number of components in infinite number of ways, potentially, to come up with something that will always be bound in that conceptual space. And so by definition, it would be limited and not have the power that is possible in this other stream of singularities that results in a second singularity. And today, I'm going to focus on this fourth book in the Applications in Cosmology of Light series, which is a book essentially on transhumanism. But the book itself is called Triumph of Love, a mathematical exploration of being, becoming, life, and transhumanism in a cosmology of light. So if we think about transhumanism, then just very simply speaking, it refers to a philosophy whose focus is to move beyond current human limits. In this book, however, what I focus on is a perception of light in order for transhumanism to become a real thing. And what do I mean by that? So let's step back. So if we look at the evolution of these books, or the number of books that have been written in this series, the four-book series actually build on each other. So the very first book was a book called The Emperor's Quantum Computer, which is a take on quantum computation from a cosmology of light point of view. And stepping back further, this four-book series itself was built on a six-book series on cosmology of light, in which what I sought to do was mathematically frame the power, the potentiality, the possibility that having light as the basis of existence might afford. So, in this point of view, we of course know that in our physical universe, light travels at 186,000 miles per second in vacuum, which we refer to as c. And my point of view is that that speed of light is an intentionality. It's an intentionality to basically allow a particular kind of materialization to occur. So, if we consider the native state of light to be one where it travels infinitely fast, then we can hypothesize that the reality that that would create through a thought experiment, if we consider like a large globe and we have a light source at the center and that light travels infinitely fast, then we know that that light would fill up the entire globe instantaneously. So there would be a quality or a property of presence that's afforded by the way light moves. Now, further, if something not of the nature of light were to arise, then light would subsume or overcome it, and so there would be a property of power. Since everything that arises and disappears is happening in the fabric of light, therefore, light, in a sense, has a knowledge of everything happening in its space, and therefore there's this property of knowledge that's also true of this reality where light travels infinitely fast. And finally, since everything is occurring in this fabric of light, there is an implicit harmony in it because things are connected in the nature of light, and therefore this property of harmony also arises. So we can hypothesize that implicit in light, there's these properties that we can call knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And no matter how light might exist or how it might project itself or how it might precipitate, even down to 186,000 miles per second, there's really this fourfoldness that is maintained. And this fourfoldness, I'm going to make the point as we get to this book, Triumph of Love, is instrumental in the process of any kind of transhumanism or thinking about what the possibilities of transhumanism are. So essentially, we just introduced briefly this state of light where light travels infinitely fast, and we said that there's four properties that emerge as a result of it. Now, I call the series Cosmology of Light simply because if we assume that light may travel or can travel at different speeds, then we can hypothesize what kind of world it will create. They'll all be fourfold worlds, but we can hypothesize what kind of world it would create. And this precipitation would result in a materialization at this layer where light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So let me just elaborate to create the background for the essential argument in Triumph of Love. So due to a process of quantization, some kind of quantization, these properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that exist when light travels infinitely fast materialize themselves more concretely. And in that materialization, though it's not physical matter, but it's something, it's a different substance that's happening in another layer of light, we can perceive or conceive of these four essential properties becoming four sets of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And these sets can have up to infinite elements in them. And then through another quantization in which light projects itself at an even slower speed, but yet way beyond c, then we can conceive of different, unique, and an infinite number of seeds being created that are essentially due to combining the different elements in these four sets in unique combinations. And so, from that point of view, these subtle seeds become the basis of all matter that will subsequently or eventually arise. And with a third quantization, which I've argued both in this live stream and in the books that I've written, there's a particular kind of materialization that occurs when that information that's implicit in light and is expressing itself as these diverse seeds, when that materialization holds itself in a particular way, or the potential of the materialization holds itself in a particular way, then there's a threshold value that is reached that we recognize as quanta or photons or whatever the kind of quanta might be. And this then results in matter as we understand it. And therefore we say that quanta is the basis of all matter. But from this point of view, there's this organized precipitation that's taking place along these four lines that become divergent because there's now infinite number of variations within these sets or possibilities of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. So when matter and life emerge in the physical universe, there's a fourfoldness to that. And we can argue that this fourfoldness is essentially an explicitness of that implicit, of the four implicit properties in light. And because it's trying to maintain the integrality of this implicit fourfoldness, there's automatically a process of love that's occurring. And so, from this point of view, love is like a deep secret, or it's something that exists within light itself. And it becomes explicit as these four properties that materialize create the different foundations of matter and life that emerge. And let's give some examples of that. But that kind of trust for the materialization to hold itself in an embrace so that it creates a foundation, whether we're talking about space-time, energy, gravity, or quantum particles, or atoms, or cells, is essentially an act of love. And so, in Triumph of Love, what's being suggested is that with transhumanism, there has to be the same integrality that is the basis of it. So there has to be this wanting to connect with not only with deeper layers of light, but also with the diverse expression that light materializes as. And when that dynamic happens, that's an act of love, but that also becomes a solid foundation for any further emergence to occur. So let's take specific examples of the kinds I mentioned before. So space-time, energy, gravity. We know that these are very consequential macro parameters that define what's possible for us or how we can operate in this cosmos, if you will. But if we take a deeper look at space-time, energy, and gravity, then I'll make the case that space is a precipitation or some kind of a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. Essentially because if we think about that antecedent layer just behind the layer where light travels at c, so we're looking at the quantum veil, and just behind that, I'm proposing that there's infinite number of diverse seeds, and these seeds, they seek an arena for their materialization, and that arena we can think of as space. So the archetypal diversity of those seeds is nothing other than a glimpse of what knowledge is, or how knowledge might organize itself as it begins to precipitate in this material universe. So, space, in this point of view, is therefore a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. When we think about time, then time will track the maturity of any of these seeds that are in subtle form or have just materialized to the full potentiality that exists within them. And so time is clearly relative, but time tracks that maturity. And so there's an inevitability to what's going to happen in that point of view, because whatever is inside the seed will inevitably materialize or show itself in its fullness. And therefore, time becomes a precipitation of light's aspect of power. Now, in the process of the materialization from the subtle seed to its full material form, there's the presence of energy, and we know that energy is interchangeable with mass or matter, and therefore we can say that energy is a precipitation of light's aspect of presence. And further, we know that whatever might materialize in this physical realm, there's always an arrangement with other materializations. So seeds are collective with other seeds, or groups of seeds are collective with other groups of seeds. And therefore, when we think about this fourth cosmic parameter of gravity, it's nothing other than light's precipitation of its property of harmony. So we're saying that space-time energy gravity that creates a foundation for all subsequent emergences is an act of love. It's an act of love because there's the explicitness of what's inside light as presence, power, knowledge, harmony, becoming explicit as space-time energy gravity that then operate as one unit and a foundation from which other emergences might occur. And this kind of thinking, I'll take another example, but this kind of thinking is instrumental in thinking about the possibilities of transhumanism, because what we're saying is that any worthwhile, stable foundation that's been created materially or at the level of life has basically emulated the dynamics I just spoke about for the formation of space-time energy gravity, where the implicitness becomes explicit, and in the explicitness, there's an embrace that is love that becomes a foundation for other meaningful things to emerge. So we must see the same thing if we want to go down a path of sustainable transhumanism. And that really what this book, Triumph of Love, is exploring. But it's built on the previous books of an alternative view of quantum computation. And very, very briefly, when we think about a cosmic quantum computation, we may say that there's an arbitration between these different layers of light that I suggested have different kinds of information in them. And there's an arbitration between these different sources of information or different manifestations of information and what's already been manifested in the material plane. And this arbitration is a process of quantum computation, because we're saying that these layers of light are nothing other than a quantization of possibility that exists when light travels infinitely fast. And so implicitly, there's this quantum computation that shows itself as quantization that's occurring. And this continues at the quantum veil antecedent to light traveling at a speed c. And anything that emerges in this layer where light travels at c is due also to this persistent quantum computation that's occurring. The other book that builds on this, and that's a prerequisite to the notion of transhumanism, is, imagine you have some computational process, and that computational process has inputs and it has outputs. And we've said that the inputs are different sources of possibility that exist at different layers of light, plus also the possibility that is materializing here at this physical realm. And that those inputs create an output, and genetics and genetic type information is the output of that persistent quantum level computation. So that really is what the origins and possibilities of genetics really focus on, which is what I spoke about just a couple of days ago. And then is the idea, which is also a prerequisite to transhumanism, is the idea of singularities, or completeness manifesting itself. And here I call this the second singularity, to differentiate from the common narrative of singularity that has arisen, whether in scientific realms or in artificial intelligence, as we've comprehended it today. And this second singularity is in a sense, a capstone event, which follows a trend in which many different partial singularities have already emerged, and space-time energy gravity being one such partial singularity. And why is it a singularity? It's a singularity because it emerges from a common light-based edifice. So all the logic, all the possibilities, all the potential that exists in this light edifice is still maintained when space-time energy gravity arises. So there's a comprehensiveness, a completeness, and therefore it has the status of a singularity. But I call it partial singularity because I'm making an assumption that space-time energy gravity is perhaps that level of awareness, of self-awareness, hasn't arisen yet. So self-awareness arises when life arises and when mind arises, which are subsequent partial singularities. And when that self-awareness becomes completely aware that it is one with this light-based edifice that animates all things, then that is the basis for the second singularity. So transhumanism can be thought of as something that happens on the path to the second singularity, and perhaps also beyond whatever is beyond the second singularity. So this book, essentially, the second singularity is therefore a prerequisite also to the idea of transhumanism, because also in the book on transhumanism, or Triumph of Love, it's suggesting that any partial singularity, or a singularity that's a light-based singularity as opposed to an AI-based singularity, has implicit in it a beingness, a becomingness, the basis of life. And so whether it's space-time energy gravity, or whether it's the fourfold quantum particles that are expressed perhaps best in the Standard Model, or whether it's the atoms in a periodic table that are classified as S shell, P shell, D shell, F shell, again a fourfoldness, or whether it's molecular plans that animate a cell, that there are only four molecular plans, that of polysaccharides, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So it's when all these different components of presence, power, knowledge, harmony that are implicit in light become explicit as these fournesses, and they embrace each other, then we can say that there's a cohesive being that has manifested. So something has become that's a being. And so in a sense, these partial singularities and any light-based singularity already has something in it that is of a fullness of life, of a particular kind of life. And so when we think about transhumanism, it's basically, what I'm proposing is that this same trend has to be followed. And this trend where there's a completeness, so that this fourness that has created all these partial singularities or light-based singularities before it becomes or continues to be the basis of any effort at transhumanism. And my argument is that if that's the case, then that kind of transhumanism, as opposed to, say, something that is severed from the light-based edifice and is purely a technological conception based on conceptual space in the mind, it's going to be fundamentally different. And the possibilities that arise and the kind of development that can occur on that kind of foundation that is a light-based singularity is going to be entirely different. But again, at the base of this is love, because we're saying that that fourness that manifests itself and decides to embrace each other is nothing else but an act of love.